All right, and we are officially live. Hey friends, welcome back to my channel. It's Tori, and this is episode 7 of Imposter Syndrome, which is a relaxed, informal writer's room show where we talk about different topics in writing fantasy. And I am so excited for this episode, you guys. I have two incredible authors here with me to chat, Andrew D. Meredith and Stephen Erikson. Andrew, would you like to introduce yourself and your works?
Sure. Yeah, I'm Andrew D. Meredith. I'm the author of 2 fantasy series, the Needle and Leaf series, which has 2 books out, and the Calatian Saga series, which has 2 books out, and there will be a 3rd book coming out end of August for that one.
And Steve, for anyone who happens to not know who you are, will you introduce yourself and your works for us?
Okay, Stephen Erikson, co-creator of an extended fantasy series with Ian C. Estamont, set in, I guess, what we generally call the Malazan universe. So my books began with the 10-volume Malazan Book of the Fallen, and there's been some add-ons since then.
Mm-hmm. And I know that you are currently working on a book about writing currently. Do you have any, can you give us any kind of an idea when we should be looking for that, or do you not have any dates yet?
No dates yet, but I suspect by Christmas it should be done.
Oh, awesome. Okay. Very cool. All right. So kind of as our opener question, when we're going to be talking about world building today, and when you start a book or a series, where do you start? Is there kind of in the top down, bottom up scenario? Do you start with the bigger picture things? Do you start with smaller details? What are the very first steps that you guys take when it comes to fantasy world building? Steve?
Oh,
I'll go back and forth.
Right. Can we back up a bit and
yes,
do a definition?
Thank you.
Right,
yeah. How would you both define world building? We'll start with that one. Thank you.
All right. I think it can be misunderstood. Quite often people think in terms of world building as a kind of discrete process separate from the story. And if they think in terms of that phrase, world building, they're thinking in terms of setting, geography, various physical characteristics of where you're going to be placing your storytelling and all the rest. But of course, that's only a small part of what world building is. You have to sort of emphasize the notion of the word world, right? Because you're building everything, and that means characters, that means narrative, that means tone, atmosphere, absolutely everything. So if you just want to talk about world building in terms of establishing a setting or providing backstory or expositional historical stuff that sort of adds a sense of depth to the story you're telling, well, that's just one aspect of world building, but we can certainly focus on that because I suspect that's what people are going to be more interested in than the other stuff.
Yeah, I think it's honestly gonna we'll probably tangent into a little bit of that too, because I think, like you said, because it's such an all-encompassing piece of storytelling, figuring out how those characters and the setting and all of those different pieces fit together is essentially kind of how one of the ways that I would describe world building and how all of those different bits of the story tie in. But yeah, I think we'll probably end up touching on quite a few of those. Andrew?
I would probably define it as the outcome of the research that we as authors do to forward face and present our books. So like my wife writes historical mystery, and she always jokes that she's going to the archives and I hate doing research. So I just write fantasy because I just make it up. It's like, but I'm doing just as much work, just a different kind of work where I'm trying to lay out, cultural structures or set up a geography and how does the geography affect the cultures. So I think the world building, at least as the reader sees it, is what we end up out facing. not necessarily all that we've done, but what is at least faced out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
The milieu.
Yeah. So I think largely this will focus a lot on, all of everything outside of kind of the characters and, focusing more on the setting and the environment and the economics and all of the little bits and pieces of the cultures and the space, I guess, that the story takes place in. But I definitely think it's something that we'll come back to in some of the questions about how those things fit in with characters and other pieces. So back into the first steps. When you start, what do you start with? And do you start with kind of the bigger picture, or do you start with smaller details when you're coming fresh into a new series? Andrew?
So I come from a background of doing game design. I worked for Fantasy Flight Games, and I have always been a top-down designer versus other game designers who are building, here's a cool rule. Now, how do I make a game that presents this rule out? Versus I do tend to do a lot, probably too much, of actual like building cultures and then letting the story take place within that culture. So it's much more of a top down of what do I want to present? What new question do I want to ask that is interesting to me? And then can my plot meander through that as a setting versus saying, I plan to solve world hunger. Now, how can I write a story in a world that solves world hunger? I work the opposite of that. I create a world that may or may not solve world hunger.
I don't know. I mean, I don't know if I go top down or from I don't know. I mean, it's kind of hard to sort of separate out world building. I mean, for me, first of all fiction world builds. Doesn't matter what the genre or the setting. And so the extent to which the world you've built in your fictional world deviates from perceived reality is what sort of then defines, whatever genre you happen to be writing in. But we're all world building, and so we're all engaged in the same process of deciding what goes on the page and what doesn't. And then I would sort of think that if you are writing an expositional description of a particular setting, if all that block of text does is provide the physical details of that description, that setting, then you haven't done your job, because in providing those details, you have the opportunity to add so much more to the story. In other words, you would think in terms of tone, right? What kind of atmosphere you want to establish here? So that dictates your word choices and what you describe within that setting. If you're tying this to a point of view, then you also have the opportunity to create characterization through the description of the world and the setting. So they're all doing sort of multiple things, and so that's why I struggle to sort of separate them out. I would never want to just do an expositional dump of descriptions of some physical detail unless I had usually an ironic reason for doing so, which would be tied into a character point of view and that kind of thing. So yeah, I find it difficult to sort of parse out the notion of world building with storytelling. So.
Yeah, I actually appreciate that, because I feel like that's something that when I try to talk about world building within my work, I often have a hard time kind of, what part, like trying to figure out what part people are asking about, because there are so many different facets to that. I think I tend to go from a very like small space outwards, because usually I start with a character and then they kind of start expanding out and I start asking about their backstory and where they come from. And as I build out from that character, the world starts taking shape around them. And then another character comes in and they add, and there's overlap and that kind of thing too. So I think every once in a while I'll have some bigger picture pieces that I start with that I know I want to include, but it has to make sense from the character perspective to me before I will actually include it. So yeah, I completely get the, how do I, what part of this do we define as world building? Because yeah, that's a really good point. Alicia has a good question. As you write and the world becomes more fleshed out, how often does that affect your original planned plot, and has it ever drastically changed it? So I guess how tightly do we, like, does the world, as you flesh out and build the world farther, does that change maybe the outline that we, or the plot kind of idea that we started with?
You know, for so long, I've called myself a strong outliner. And I've been realizing, especially in the last 6 months, how much I'm not. Because I still outline. I still will say I'm an outliner, but I define my my bullet points, about 1,000 words to a bullet point. And just by saying, here's a thing that will be happening in this bullet, that gives me 1,000 words for the characters to live in. And it's more structured than just doing a straight up discovery, right? But it still provides some structure so that if that description that needs to be written is going to cause a deviation, that might be okay. And that's happened before. That's why I usually reassess it, like 50% through a manuscript. I'll reassess the rest of the outline, and the same with the last third, because there's going to be some change, or I'll realize that something that occurs late that I thought was going to occur later happens a lot earlier, and so it's no longer necessary. Well, I've got maybe a gap that's caused by that. So there's always reassessment. And maybe I don't keep that description in. Maybe it goes into a trunk file because it helped me know what this city looks like. But yeah, it is just a bit of exposition and didn't help the plot. So I can pull it out and instead focus the camera to five seconds later to just a block, as opposed to describing a whole city, and have a better service to the plot by doing that. So yeah, can it affect the plot? Absolutely. Do I want it to affect the plot? That is always up for grabs on situational in the situation.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm not too bothered by plot. I know where the ending is.
Yeah.
So I know the sort of where I'm headed, and these days I don't really outline much of anything. I'll give character lists for settings and scenes that I'm writing. But I like the characters sort of take the narrative and go where they want to go with it. And I guess that's part of it is, the Malazan world, at least, is because it was gamed. Both Cam and I, we know backwards and forwards.
Right.
So it's the equivalent of taking, I don't know, going up to almost postdoc level of studying Byzantine history, right? You read everything. And so you've got a good sense of that world and that place. So it's not as much of sort of inventing from scratch in terms of what goes into the building of a story. So yeah, I rely a lot on spontaneity, and I leave that open, because I found long ago that if I over diagram and over plot something, it's a mess. I lose interest because there's no spontaneity in there. There's no opportunity for which I can actually entertain myself in the process of discovery of what characters say and what they do. So that's the kind of stuff that really keeps me going.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because I've talked to so many authors who kind of on both sides of the whether you want to call it plotter, pantser, architect, gardener side of things. And I think flexibility is the thing that I hear on both sides the most, is, even for people that plot out or plan out a lot, that they still have that kind of level of flexibility, that if they get to a point, and then it kind of turns to discovery writing for a little bit, because that allows them to figure out, okay, I have a knot here, like, how do we fix this and move forward? I would say, because I'm very discovery writer. Yeah, as the world becomes more fleshed out, things definitely change for me. And characters sometimes, I mean, you guys probably know how that is too. There's a character that you just off here on the side that you didn't think was ever going to like turn into anything, and all of a sudden they're in the main cast, and completely changing a side of the plot somehow. Or so for me, that's a pretty normal writing style. Because I'm very much the same way. I get bored if I have too much of a rigid outline, because then I feel like I've already written the book, and then I just want to write something else. But I have found moments where I needed a little bit of an outline to get me through the next few scenes so that I can keep track of, okay, in what order and how am I doing this? But I don't usually utilize it overall through the book. But yeah, it does definitely change, which is kind of the fun part of writing, right? Is seeing what happens and what comes up as you're going through the book. And that kind of goes into another question I had for you guys, which is, so much of what we show in the final product is just the tip of the iceberg. And, Steve, you mentioned that you and Cam have, this just massive archive of information in the Malazan world. So how do you decide what is important to show and what to keep just for your own archives that the readers don't necessarily get to see? How do you find that balance, and how do you make that decision of what to show? Steve?
It goes back to that notion of carrying, or rather having more than one potential function for whatever you put in there. So the details need to reflect in some way the subtext of what it is you're writing. And so being subtext, just by definition, it's not showing up front and center. It's underlying stuff. And that has its own sort of currents, and it's like a flowing river underneath the surface of your story. And so you choose those details. But if you're creating a scene and opening a story and inventing like on the fly just to set the scene, I found it very useful to pay attention to the details that I do put in to build that setting, and to find among those details something that can potentially go beyond the denotative, so beyond just the definition meaning of the word, so that it has connotations and it has resonance. And that's the kind of thing I in my mind I underline it, and I'm gonna make use of it again later on, somewhere in the scene or in the end of the chapter or at the end of the novel, whatever. So there's kind of a filter in which the details that you put on the page, some may end up being only useful for that moment, but other things you can carry through. And usually the stuff that carries through relates more to character development and theme than it does to anything else.
Yeah.
So I had to learn over the last 5 years that I'm not nearly as clever as I thought I was. So, you always hear about the iceberg when you're an early writer, and I don't have a tip of an iceberg. I have a whole iceberg. And then I got to really writing 5 years ago and really diving in and realizing not only that all I had was a tip, but it was hollow, because I was a cocky young kid who hadn't written anything down. It was all here. I know it all. And so I hadn't written anything down. And so as I started to write down the things I had memorized for 20 years since I was a teenager, I started to realize how much of it was actually just shorthand for things I thought were really great and actually were wildly derivative. And so I had to start redesigning that. And that's a mistake that I made that I had to then fix, so I wasn't showing so much. When I have something that, if I think it's info dumpy, it's probably info dumpy. And if it looks like it's probably too descriptive, I have to ask myself, like you say, it's not just, is this going to further the plot, but am I being too self-important with this? And, we can describe a city. Yeah, but I know every trade that I've put into the city and what all of its exports are. Nobody cares. Write it down. So you can care.
Yeah.
And someday when you write your RPG setting, you can have it in there. That's great. Good for you. But right now, the story is what you're trying to tell. And so I don't even look so much of it as an iceberg anymore, as more like gold mining, right? Like we go panning for gold and we go looking for dust on the ground. That's what we need. We need the gold now. And then at times, and that's the tip of the iceberg, right? The information that's topical, that has some depth, maybe. When you really need to go deep, that's when you build a shaft and you really dig into something because it's important to what you're doing. Right. Or not. You can also hide that gold away in that little file that you're never going to open again. But at least you know the economy, the economics of a city for your own sake.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and that just kind of furthers us as artists, right? You know, designing out the economic side of a city just helps us understand our own world better, and therefore it translates theoretically, you know, more authentically to the reader because it feels lived in. It feels like a place that the author knows these things about it.
And you know, there's only a few people on Earth who care how Van Gogh mixed his yellows and what pigments they used. And those obsessive professors, they live and die for that kind of information. The rest of the viewers who are reading it, whether they're obsessed with Van Gogh or whether they're just walking through an art gallery, don't care how the yellow was made. They just know that he did something and it was magical. And so Van Gogh doesn't need a description box talking about how he used ultramarine for his blue.
Yeah.
He did, though.
Well, that's just it. Van Gogh knew.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? And so when you're reading, you know, a work of fiction, you'll know fairly quickly if the writer is comfortable with the setting they've created, if they know the background and they know far more than is probably even healthy regarding that created, invented world. Because you can tell the absence of that. You can tell almost immediately.
And even with that artist's body of work too, right? You can have a fan who's really obsessed about that particular artist, and they can tell when this particular poem felt like they were kind of just cashing it in. And maybe that's not true. That's just while they're observing it because it didn't feel like it was well written. And then another critic is going to look at it and go, you mean the best thing he ever wrote? He put a lot of work into that one line poem. And so then it becomes personal preference.
Right.
But you know, we owe it to ourselves to do everything we can to bring our all.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, part of that's creating the space for the reader to turn into a fan. You know, like somebody who has read through, you know, you had to hook them into the Kalatian Saga or Sumalazin, and then suddenly they found something that really mattered to them and they really loved, and then they become, oh, now I'm going to go back and I'm going to reread and I'm going to, you know, start digging into this and seeing that second layer. So I think we're kind of creating like multiple reading experiences every time we write, because we're writing for the people who are just coming to this book, that are experiencing our world for the first time. And we're also creating something that people are going to come back to and find more things that are interesting and theoretically fun to read every time they come back. Because that's the cool part, right? When we hear people say, oh, I've read this 3 times and I find something new each time I read it. And that's really, I think, where that layering starts to show and how much the author knows. So both of you, so I've read both of you, and both of you utilize a lot of and this goes back into the character side of things, kind of the social hierarchies and organized factions and pantheons, and all of those are very carefully kind of organized and laid out. So beyond the physical details of the world, how do you go about organizing a society of characters? Kind of where do you, because people are, I mean, that's such a huge undertaking, I feel like, when you're populating a world and starting to try to figure out, okay, you know, geographically and you know, cultures and all of that kind of stuff. So dipping into the character side of that, Steve, where do you start with that?
Well, I guess it helps having, you know, real world experience, which is not to say that you necessarily have to be wandering through the jungles of Guatemala, or flying all over the place and finding different sort of environments and settings and encountering different cultures. All of that's extremely useful, and if you can pull that off, do it. But you can get this from books as well. A lot of the foundational principles of the development and evolution of a culture you can get from a used bookstore. You go in and you buy Introduction to Anthropology, Cultural Anthropology. It doesn't matter if it's 5 years out of date, because the stuff that's more recent, that's more meta oriented anyways. It's more theoretical in terms of how to interpret the data, but the data has already been gathered. And so you look into those things. Those kind of books are dirt cheap, easy to find, or you just go onto YouTube, and the availability of documentaries on history, prehistory, ancient history, military history, you name it. It's just, there's so much out there right now that's easily accessible, and all that stuff is very helpful when it comes to building something that actually makes sense. So where the culture is as Andrew mentioned, is bound to the geographical limitations, subsistence basis, and all of these things that can really shape a culture. But then at the same time, the great thing about cultures is there are some weird ones out there. Through time, there's some really, really weird things out there.
Yeah.
And so that kind of stuff, it's obscure, but if you find it, take note, and it might become useful at some point.
Yeah. This is kind of a tangent, and I'm going to obviously have Andrew answer that too, but do you feel like we as modern fantasy writers, with all of that information at our fingertips, have an easier time creating our own separate worlds, than a lot of our classic fantasy predecessors did?
No. No, in many ways, I would say it's harder. One of the reasons is, especially in fantasy has moved into the mainstream, so it's ubiquitous, which means you see repeating of tropes,
right,
and quite often a very particular Freytag's pyramid narrative style for storytelling, which a lot of audience now has that expectation of finding that in every fantasy book. So if you're going to write against that, then you're putting yourself at risk. So I think there's almost too much stuff out there, in a lot of respects.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Andrew, what do you think?
So, excuse me. I 100% agree. I think documentaries and podcasts give you so much story seed. It's important to both understand the context of where those are coming from, and also where you can then allow to spin off. Like in a single character, I might say, you know what, I'm going to base this character 100% started based off of my uncle, and then over the course of a draft, it's not my uncle anymore. It's this totally new character, but it gave me some shorthands to work with as I go. And I think the same can happen with world building and plot. Like I can think right now, I was listening to Hardcore History with Carlin, and he had a single episode, just so like 4 hours long, on the siege of Munster and the Anabaptist rise and how absolutely crazy that whole situation was. And I was like, oh, I'm using this. But not just wholesale using it, saying there's so much of where you can take a moment in history and then spin it off, not only just to be unique, but what if it didn't? You have a particular king in Egypt who suddenly decides to change the whole country to monotheism. And then the very next generation undid all of that. Well, what happens if it kept going? If he kept going, what kind of spin do you then get in that particular thing? And just looking at a particular king try to rise and do a thing, you can take a lot of that plot and say, but what if it worked? It didn't, obviously. And you said it's not easy. It's not easy for us anymore the farther we go along, because we also yes, World building's easy, but not once you put all the context in. If you say, well, I'm going to take this Egyptian story and I'm going to tell it in a Slavic setting. It's like, yeah, but now it's a Slavic setting. That's a totally different set of values. And okay, cool. If you're now thinking of those things, now you have a better layer, because those two things grinding on each other are going to create a completely unique story that doesn't feel like you just pulled it out of Egyptian history and stuck it into Russia.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So Andrew, with the starting your society of characters, you have a lot of very detailed orders, religious orders and things in your series. So where do you start with that?
With what I know, and then looking at what I don't know. So like the paladins my paladins are pretty clerical, but also military. So I start with easy things like, what ranks do I want to have in place? Is this a realistic set of ranks you can have built up? How does it mesh with European monasticism? And then taking that and saying, yeah, but what were the Eastern Orthodox doing at that era that I want to emulate? Studying Eastern Orthodoxy so that I can then lens back towards Catholicism, realize there's things that I totally know everything about that. I didn't until I could look at it from a different walking backwards. And that way, and familiarity is important. If I was to just say, well, I'm just going to base everything on Japanese hierarchy, and it's like, yeah, but why? Am I just doing that just to be weird? Is that smart? Probably not. So is there something I need from that militaristic society that I can borrow and then layer in and allow the two to sift on each other until they form something that feels realistic, as opposed to just a knockoff of Christianity.
We mentioned info dumping a little bit ago, so I want to go into that a little bit, because that gets brought up all the time, and usually in context with world building as it relates to setting and historical details and that kind of thing. So how do you guys balance exposition in storytelling and how it's portrayed? And I know it's such a subjective thing that everybody has different boundaries of, yeah, this info dump is totally fine, and the next person absolutely hates it. So there's a level of subjectivity to that for sure. But how do you guys balance that? What's your take on exposition and how much of it to add? Andrew, do you want to start that one?
Well, this is where my imposter syndrome came in about 6 months ago, because I had people saying, well, you don't info dump. And I was like, yeah, I do. I info dump all the time. And it caused me to do a lot of introspection to figure out what they meant and what I meant by disagreeing with them. And I realized, I don't know if this is just it's a self-realization, but that info dumps become info dumps when they are really fat, but they aren't info dumps when they feel like they're part of life, right? We're info dumping right now, right? We're sitting here and we're info dumping, and you're listening to me talk for multiple paragraphs. But while you're doing that, maybe you're looking around the room that you're sitting in and going, oh man, you're still listening, we're still involved, but we might be thinking, I do need to dust that light. There's things that we do, and the same thing can happen in a in a travel log. Someone's telling a story and telling we're going to go into the city and blah 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 plot, and at the same time, so I realized what I ended up doing is breaking up all of my fat paragraphs with actions that are moments of normalcy. So and so's talking, and then so and so stirs the fire. So and so's talking, someone preps their bedroll and puts it down. It isn't necessarily that simple every time, but just by breaking up your info dumps in 3 sentences and putting actions in between, it can be much more natural, because we already do that. And even if like we ignore someone says he said in a book, we might ignore them, me looking at the beer list on the wall when we go out and have a chat over a beer. But we still do that. We all do that, because we're all the main characters of our own story, and we're constantly looking around. And so I guess that's what I was doing. And so now I've become much more conscientious of the fact that I was doing that. And so now I'm going through all of my books and going, wait, where have I info dumped? And is there a big text that I could have broken up with a few more actions just to make it more palatable? I still think I info dump, but
Steve?
Well, I may be the wrong person, because a lot of people complain I don't provide enough information. So, I mean, my rule, because I started as a short story writer, is less is more.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm extremely reluctant to give away extraneous background information that's not relevant to the characters in the moment. So they reveal to the reader only what they know and only what is important to them at that moment. And the rest will just be this formless haze beyond their attention span or beyond their interests. But in that haze, you can hint at things that are sitting there, that the character whose point of view you're using may not even be paying attention to. So you can use all the characters in a scene. So in other words, it need not be one character who world builds. It may be, or info dumps rather. It may be a multitude of characters. And the other thing is, as the writer, don't presume the veracity of your characters in terms of info dumping, right? Everybody's got an agenda. Everybody's got reasons for saying the things they do, and for framing a story that they're going to tell in a particular way that makes them look good, or that avoids all the mistakes they made, et cetera, right? So there are other motivations. And this is why I mentioned earlier the idea that you carry more than just the surface expositional stuff, right? You're carrying character motivation, you're carrying the potential of characterization all the way through. And if you're doing all of these other things, then info dumping does not feel like info dumping, because it's doing other tasks at the same time, which is adding depth to that particular scene or whatever it is you're writing. Because then there's a multitude of things going on, similar to what Andrew said. There's characters engaging with each other, there are characters sparring with each other, characters being cagey with each other in terms of backstories and the stories they're going to tell. And once you've done a scene like that, then you're doing a lot more than just info dumping.
Right. Yeah. I think one of the things I notice a lot in books is that when it breaks the fourth wall a little bit, and we get a little bit of the author addressing the audience, which isn't always a bad thing. Sometimes that works very well. But a lot of times I see people kind of using a character so that the author can tell the reader something. And it doesn't sound like, they choose a character that I don't know that this character feels, based on what you've told me up to this point, that this character would have a big monologue about that specific topic, or they might, thinking about, depending on which character or what group of characters are giving the information, if that's how you're choosing to do it, make sure you know what details would each of these characters care about. And you have now kind of an unreliable narrator situation where each person is giving the info dump from their own lens, which means that they shouldn't all match up in theory. They should all be very different versions of the same information. And I think people don't lean into that enough, because they want to give the reader the right information. Like, this is actually what happened, and you need to know what actually happened. So they don't allow, and that's where the characters start to feel a little bit staged, right? Or scripted, because then you realize, oh, okay, well, that's exactly what happened. And you kind of forget that it's coming from a singular perspective on whoever's speaking. So that's something that I notice a lot in books when it comes to info dumping, that always kind of pulls me out of the story a little bit. Like, you realize it's this character that's telling us this right now. And this feels just way too like it's the author trying to tell me something instead of the character. So,
it's much more interesting to have a story where in the end you find out that half of the stuff you told them was lies,
right?
Then just Elrond telling us for 50 pages, here are the facts that you must know. But this is just true. And it's like, okay, got it. Now we have context. But plot's much more interesting if you find out much later on that huge philosophical conversation between two characters, one of them was bald-faced lying just to get a rise out of the other one.
Mm-hmm.
And now you've got this whole other plot line that's just exploded. And
yeah. Well, it kind of makes me think about, I just purchased a book called The Wager. It just recently came out, and it's a historical book about a shipwreck and mutiny that happened. And the first set of survivors comes back and survives and finds, I think they landed in Brazil, and everybody just thought they were heroes. And there was this big thing, they survived, and everybody, and then all of a sudden, a few months later, like 3 or 4 other survivors that have been picked up on a different ship came in and told a very different story about what had happened back on the island. And to me, that's the cool part about what we're playing with. If you're dealing with real flawed characters who are, unreliable narrators, you're going to get different sides of the story, and you can't ever possibly know theoretically what happened, because if it's real life, it's different for every person. Like the narrative's going to change.
Right. And so take that notion and extend it to the reading of history, because it's the same thing.
Yep.
Right. I mean, there is no definitive historical version of anything.
Yeah.
And so you can have info dumps that are running completely contradictory to each other. In which case, you're having fun with something else. There, you're playing around with the idea of what is reliable. In any kind of cultural manifestation of its own origins, its own history, we know that it's subject to constant revision, depending on the moment.
Yeah.
So,
and those that say they aren't, those that say there isn't, are hiding something.
Yeah, no kidding. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that, we could have a whole spin-off of this conversation just about character voices and how, deciding who says what and who gets to tell what part of the story, and because there's so much to that. But you kind of mentioned this, Steve, when we brought up info dumping, where one of the things that I hear about Malazan, and I'm sure you do all the time too, is that there's no, what people call hand holding. There's no hand holding. And I've heard that about other books too. And I feel like I'd be curious from your perspective, what do you think contributes to that? And what role do you and also Andrew see your readers having within the story?
I don't know. I mean, part of it may just be the particular narrative style that the book is written in. Because I started short story writing, basically contemporary fiction, this kind of stuff. There's a lot that is sort of impressed upon a beginning writer with that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Brevity was one thing. And, that was many years ago. And since that time, occasionally I deliberately write against that kind of stuff because I get tired of it.
Yeah.
But I remember being told numerous times, right? Show, don't tell. Show, don't tell. And so that just sort of became built into my writing process. And so maybe that's where the hand-holding thing is. But I mean, at the same time, it almost didn't matter where I was going to start with the Malazan stuff. You were going to be in media res. You're going to be dropped in.
Yeah.
Because it's a history and there is no beginning and no end to these things. So somewhere we're going to have to drop you, the reader, in. And so it was then a question of, well, where am I going to do this? And what became interesting was I dropped, and Cam and I, because we wrote the script, the feature film script version of this, we decided to drop the reader or the viewer in almost post everything we had done in the role-playing games. Almost after all of that stuff. That became our backstory. That became our foundational history. And then we built on top of that. So yeah, there's a lot that's unexplained,
Yeah.
and then it's just a question of whatever is in there is sufficient to carry the reader through in the story, as long as they don't sweat, about the specific, like knowing all the character names or this kind of stuff. Not actually that important. It's how the story is propelling itself along, and the other stuff you'll pick up as you go, and don't worry about it. So that was the kind of approach, and yeah, there is plenty of resistance to that. So
Yeah.
Stephen, was that a term you had heard before you had really started writing it, or was it something that being no hand holding, like was that a term that that readers ascribed to you, and then you kind of realized that was something you were doing, or was it something that was kind of partially pre-intended?
Pre-intended. Wow. I mean, I'm having to think back a long ways here. No, I never thought in terms of hand-holding. This is something that has come up as a reader response more than anything else, which of course then makes it relevant, and so it's worth thinking about.
Yeah.
But no, I was massively inspired stylistically and structurally with Frank Herbert's Dune. Again, in media res, it drops you in, and there's so much backstory, and there's so many things that are behind the political machinations that are not explained. And I adored it. I loved that. And it never struck me as being in any way unusual to apply that to a fantasy setting. Especially since so much of Dune is actually fantasy as opposed to science fiction. So yeah, it literally never occurred to me that this was going to be an issue.
Yeah. I think that's one of the most fascinating things that no author can prepare for, is the ascriptions, the ascribing that the readers do to you. And it's very easy to react to it and be upset that they see something in your work that you had never intended to. But half the time then you look backwards and go, yeah, I did do that, didn't I? And then you start to realize you can really lean into it. Like this whole cozy fantasy thing that been rising, I mean, always been around, right? But there's been so much of this last year that I was thinking, wonder if I could write a cozy fantasy. And that was right before I had 2 reviewers drop and go, so Andrew wrote this really cozy fantasy. I don't know if cozy is the right word, but it's kind of cozy. And I'm like, oh, okay, I guess I can write cozy. Just keep doing what I'm doing.
Sorry, I'm not familiar with this new.
So the cozy subgenre fantasy is a low stakes fantasy that's very kind of relaxed, and the best example is Travis Baltry's new, or not
Legends
new,
and
but,
Lattes.
Legends and Lattes got picked up by Tor, and the plot is an orc retires from being a barbarian and opens a coffee shop. That's the plot beginning to end. Okay. And well, that doesn't sound exciting. It's actually a pretty good book, and it's really exciting because she opens a coffee shop in a city that's never had coffee before. It sounds good to me, but because of that, now a lot of people are also writing cozy fantasy. And what does that mean? And so it's, even though it's been around, like you can say that a lot of Discworld is cozy because it has that low stakes normality that's just very familiar to it. A slice of life, another word for it. But it's so interesting watching effectively a new subgenre that's been around forever kind of all of a sudden just explode and become a thing. But, anyway.
Yeah, cozy has definitely been. I mean, we've seen stuff with that, with like kind of the cozy mystery kind of genre like that. I think it just kind of had a little resurgence in fantasy for sure. Lately.
I don't know that cozy is even the right word for it, right? But it's what is used in mystery, so it becomes a nomenclature that's easy to adopt across into the fantasy genre.
Yeah. Andrew, kind of following that up with the same question I posed to Steve, I don't know that you really answered the question of what role do you see your readers having within the story?
That's such a huge question, right?
I know.
like from as an artist, right? That there's the whole debate on when can an artist call themselves an artist? And does the viewer of the artist define that someone's an artist? When are you an author? When are you a writer? And so that's, I think each reader is going to bring their own experience and does get to take out of it what they get from it. There is authorial intention. I know some might not agree with me, but there is intention that comes from the writer itself. That doesn't mean it's what the reader takes from it. And I mean, why do we write epic fantasy? Because we get to write multiple characters, and if the reader latches on to just one, and that one character carries them through the whole series, success. Yes, they have to read through other characters they don't like, but they're still here, so they must like them some, right? And so our job as bards is to just present a story. And if that's theater back for the ages. You go to Italian Commedia dell'arte of Italy, and Shakespeare did the same thing, where you have your main cast of characters who are there to tell the story, and then you have the zanies. You have the Marx Brothers, who are not there to tell a story. They're there to tell slapstick. Often has really good story compared to like the Three Stooges being just slapstick. But we as artists, what are we presenting in a way that's going to keep different people in, and not just for the sake of bringing an audience in, but because we're here to tell a story. And so, I mean, bring whatever you want as a reader. I'm happy to have you read my books, but also I want you here for a reason, because I do have a story that I'm trying to tell. It's not just watch me do magic tricks. Because I mean, we like to tell stories. We like to listen to stories, and that alone is a reward in and of itself.
Yeah. I think a question that, might kind of fit into that is, when you're creating the story and building the world, are you building it to tell a story for the characters in it? Or are you world building for the reader experience? You know what I mean? Like there's a difference, I think, between the way that you're viewing the final product. Is this, because I'm very cocooned when I write, and I don't think about how people are going to receive it. I don't think about what people are going to like, which characters. Like I'm very much I'm building this world, and here's the characters in it, and everything in it is about them. And once I have a final product, then we start talking about the reader experience and how they're receiving what I've created in that little sphere. But yeah, like you said, I mean, that's a whole, I don't know, Steve, if you have anything to add to that, but that's a whole nother episode, I feel like.
Yeah. Well, one hopes that every writer who writes is also a reader and began as a reader. That may sound nonsensical, but I've been talking to some people who are teaching creative writing who have students come in who basically say they want to be a novelist, but they've never read a book. So, yeah. So, yeah, it sounds nonsensical, but maybe it isn't anymore. I don't know.
Yeah.
So if you're a reader, what were the things that appealed to you? What are the things that really sort of hit the mark, and what missed, and why? Because that answering why is what the writer has to do. If you're not a writer and you're just a reader, you don't have to answer the why, right? You didn't like that book, you put it away, and that's that. Or you like that book and you start collecting more of the same author, whatever. But for the writer, no, we got to figure out why that worked and why this didn't work.
Yeah.
Because that's the learning process. And I remember when I've taught sort of introductory creative writing classes, I basically begin with a warning that because I'm going to teach narrative structure in fiction, your reading experience will never be the same after this class, after this course. It will never be the same.
Yeah.
And you may end up actually regretting the whole process, because things that you adored reading growing up, you go back to and you go, oh man. And that's a shame, because there's great value in that initial kind of innocence, if you will, that allows the imagination to just cut loose and is not concerned with construction scenes or sentence pattern or anything along those lines. And so it's transported quite effortlessly into these magical worlds. And if you take a writing course where narrative structure is sort of nailed down, which is not always the case, but it will change everything. It changes everything, and sometimes, you end up feeling nostalgic for your lost innocence.
Yeah. Do you guys find that that's something that, because I know like all of us are readers, and can you take off in any point, can you take off some of that writer brain when you're going into somebody else's book? Because I find, especially the further into my writing career that I get, the harder and harder it's becoming to remove that. And I think part of that is too, we as artists are finding our own voice and style and becoming more and more comfortable in it and confident in it. So then reading something from a completely different style, or it can be, I would have like, and you start doing the little tinkery thing in your head, so yeah, I definitely have noticed the older I'm getting and the more I get into my craft, the harder it is for me to take that off.
Yeah, and we never stop learning.
Right.
We never stop. So
yeah. And I think it's still important I try to read widely, because that allows me to push keep expanding that comfort zone bubble, so that at least it's a larger comfort zone, with more things in it. But yeah, Joe had the point, turning off an editor brain. I can't imagine. That's something that I know that I would like to try, but I would never do it at this point, because I know that I'd never come back from that. So for each of you, what's kind of your favorite, kind of a lighter bit in the middle here? What is your favorite piece of world building? What's something designing in your world that you just get really excited about every time? Andrew?
So right now, it's probably non-human cultures. I really enjoy doing that. When I really and not just for the fun of it, but they're really going deep. Like for example, in the Clatian Saga, there's a race of basically Ninja Turtles. Whatever, they're turtle people, because that was when I was a kid. But they came from a pre-culture from which two other cultures also developed, and I know I have to develop those other two eventually. And actually, I intentionally shelved them because they were way too derivative of in-world cultures that I did not want to emulate in ways that would be disrespectful. So I shelved those other two, but I have to come back to them. But to do that, I have to finish designing this culture so I can figure out where where their anthropology comes from. What are their burial techniques now? So I can write a murder mystery in this setting, so that I can figure out what their original burial techniques were, and then going sideways into the other cultures and does that. So I like doing that sort of thing. I have to do one right now for a complete overhaul of another race, a Minotaur race, but not just Minotaurs because Minotaurs, but like what happens when they all live in different continents, just like humanity. What happens when you have divergence? And I love doing that sort of thing, but also topically starting with, they're going to look like this, this, and this, but why do they look like this, this, and this? And then going back to a root. So I really enjoy back designing and figuring things out, and then realizing where I think I'm way too clever, so I can chop that all out and then build it back up.
Yeah.
Well, I worked professionally, I guess, 18 years as an archaeologist. So
that's cool.
That's so cool.
Well, it was great fun. And I keep my hand in it. But one of the areas that sort of was my great fascination was to walk a landscape and peel it back through time. And so looking at a landscape and trying to imagine how it ended up looking the way it does, and what were the events that contributed to that. And some of those are natural events, but in many places they're anything but. They're human caused events. So I remember moving when I first moved to the UK. That landscape just fascinated the hell out of me, because I'd come from Manitoba, where the indigenous presence on the landscape had very little impact. It was quite respectful, if you will, in terms of not altering the environment to a large degree. Go to the UK, and everything you see has been altered by human activity. Absolutely everything. The fact that you can see open landscapes as you're sitting on the train and you're passing through the countryside, none of that would exist without the deforestation of the Neolithic. Mm-hmm. So we've got all this stuff, and then the introduction of particular livestock that kept the undergrowth down and sort of began to shape and manage everything in the landscape. So that's the kind of thing that I really like, is if I'm going to build a scene and set it somewhere, I immediately start thinking about what predates this, what gave shape to what it is we're looking at now, and then in the descriptions I can hint at those things, having to go right into them. So that's kind of one of the things I have probably an unhealthy obsession over.
Yeah, I think I can't remember if it was on your blog or on Facebook, but every once in a while you'll post the landscape photos, and I always enjoy seeing those, because it's fun as a writer to just like kind of sponge in all of that and start asking questions about what could this look like if, So yeah, that's.
But the landscape actually can change for you through time, right? Mm-hmm. When I was growing up, our family was really poor, and so we would go out every weekend to catch fish. And this is in the late 60s, early 70s, and there were a lot of fish. The places weren't fished out yet, but we would fill up a freezer for winter food, basically. And so one of the places I was in was a place called the Whiteshell Park. It had a multitude of lakes. And so my experience of that landscape at that time was kind of like, I guess in my imagination, it was where cavemen lived, basically. I'm just a kid. And then in my early 20s, I'm suddenly working in that park, and we're mapping petroforms all over the Precambrian shield. So it's the same landscape, but it has fundamentally changed in front of me. And that can be quite interesting in terms of your characterizations and stuff. You're bringing characters when they return to a place, it's not the place they left. And so that becomes very interesting to explore as well.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm actually coming up on a scene in the next probably end of my book 1 right now, where I have a character who was taken from his childhood home and has lived up until he's 18-ish in this completely different place, and then he's going to be going back to that city. And I'm really excited to get to that part where I can describe him with that kind of strange, there's a familiarity, but at the same time it's been taken away.
Yeah, you can't go back. Yeah.
You can't. Yeah, and it's. I'm excited to try that kind of description and see, try to imagine it through his eyes and see what I can come out with that. And that goes back to the world building, and for this character, what are the things he's going to notice? Because those are the things I want to lean into. What are the things that he's going to pick out as landmarks from childhood that now look different or have changed? So yeah, I think that goes back to, what we were talking about, the details of world building. Make it mean something, make it matter, give weight to the perspective you're writing in, or, something that can foreshadow in the future. But whatever details we put in, making them matter is really important. People talk about immersive world building all the time. And I find that I totally understand the word, because I've been totally immersed in books before. But do you guys think that comes down to largely kind of a subjective experience, or do you think that there are certain benchmarks within world building that help create a more immersive reading experience? Andrew looks like he's thinking. Steve, do you have an answer for that one?
Maybe evoking the sense of mystery. Don't over-explain. Don't provide all those details, which are not details, obviously, that your characters would even know or even think about or worry about. So that, to me, that sense of mystery is what I experience whenever I travel. Right? Whenever I come to a place that I've never been to before, that's what I sort of immerse myself into, is that sense of familiarity, but also unfamiliarity. And it can happen anywhere, right? The culture you are in is the culture you notice the least, right? You just don't notice the details because you're a participant within it. And you take these things for granted. So even though if you were to fly to Paris tomorrow, and you'll recognize that there's McDonald's kicking around and there's Burger King and recognizable cultural symbols from wherever you came from, you're still going to feel that dislocation when you walk in there and you find the McDonald's is serving croissant. So there are these things that a student writer can pay attention to, in terms of no matter where you go, even if it's the town next to yours, or a city 200 miles away, things are done differently, and that kind of distinction is the kind of thing that you want to mentally take note of. So anyways,
yeah,
I think of like the axe hounds in Sanderson's Stormlight Archives. He takes, what do they look like? You don't know until almost the end of the first book, before I think they actually put an illustration in. He never really describes them. You're like, that's not a hound. Yeah, but there's no dogs, so that's their dog. And so it becomes kind of an assumed, well, everybody has an axe hound, right? And there's ways for us to do that even in the familiar, right? Like, so you go to another culture, and if you're from America and you see a cute puppy, oh, cute puppy, I'm going to go pet it. And you're in a foreign culture that maybe that culture encourages every dog absolutely bite anybody that touches it. And it bites you. And I'm like, why did you try to pet it? Well, it's a cute dog. All dogs bite. Now you've established immediately in this invented culture that dogs bite, period. They're just bad. And now you have all this room for, in making up idioms just based off of that, for that culture, that creates an immersion off something that's very familiar, and that's a dog, right? By subverting that trope of, no, but all dogs here bite. And that doesn't mean all dogs bite. It just means here they do, until they don't. And so there's so many little tiny things you can do to immerse that don't take a lot of work, but also you shouldn't be trying too hard. You're trying too hard just to immerse for the sake of immersion, then that's all you're doing. And your reward has been given to you just by the act of you doing it for yourself. But there's also so many little things we can do. Like, even I think of, like, I mentioned trades earlier, but like if you're describing a city and you choose a very off trade that is not normal enough, like say glazier. I've used glaziers before in stories where several cities there's a glassworks. And it's like, now I'm immediately establishing, without having to go into detail, that this culture likes glass. It's easy to make, and it's probably has affluence enough to afford glass. I don't have to go into details. There's a huge glass economy. I can just say there's a glazier, or I can say there's a massive copper works. Okay, there must be a copper seam somewhere nearby. So many little things you can do without going into 750 word descriptions of the mining trade of a city, even though it's there.
Yeah. Well, and I think, going back to the idea of the kind of lack of hand-holding, like, I feel like that almost can create a more immersive experience, because you're inviting the reader to pay attention to you're not giving them, kind of goes back to just, do you want to have all the details just here? Or do you want to actually have to, like, be an active participant within that storyline? And see, okay, what am I noticing here? Like, what's important? Is this important? I don't know. I'll have to see if that comes back in, or whatever it is. And I think that naturally kind of draws you into a further immersion because you're really active in the read.
Yeah, we'll use all the senses,
Yeah.
right? As opposed to a description that's just visual. You want the smells, the sounds, the works. You know, if you've got a copper foundry somewhere, you want ash in the air, you know, floating around. You want that smell. So all those things. I mean, one of the best and most effective examples you can look at would be John Steinbeck's Cannery Row. Read the first page. You don't have to read any more. Just read the first page. For world building, it is unbeatable. And he uses all the senses.
I just bought that last week, actually. So yeah, I'm excited to read it. Yeah.
You know, and I think another reason to have those 5 senses is not just to give a well-rounded picture, but to see who you can get on the hook, right? I had a scene I wrote, and my editor did not like that I described that the character who's blind could smell the dust being swept out of houses because it was spring. And he's like, nobody smells dust. Well, let's change it to flowers. And I'm like, you're wrong. I smell everything. My wife smells nothing, thankfully for me. So it's great for my sanity. She can't smell anything, but I smell everything. So scent is very important to me. There are those out there who can't smell dust being swept out of a house. I didn't write it for them. I wrote it for the 5 other people in the world who can smell the dust coming out of the houses, because I wanted that immersion, and I couldn't use sight because she's blind. So I mean, I guess I'm in that as an encouragement that we as writers also need to stick to our guns when it comes to obviously there's times when we can be over long-winded like I'm doing now, but also there's times when we need to say things that are important to us as authors, because there will be somebody out there who it identifies with, and it maybe only be one reader, but that's all that matters. If you get one reader on that one line who says, man, you just took me back to childhood because you described sweeping out of a house, I'm like, you're welcome.
Yeah.
I remember writing a story in, I think, my second year at Iowa, kind of a gothic Frozen North style story, and so there were details in that story that included black spruce exploding in the cold. And I remember the workshop that everybody was raising questions of, you know, that was sort of a push beyond reality, that I had invented something. And it was like, no, you know, I've camped in these places in the winter, and black spruce explode. And they're like, they sound like gunshots. And I made use of that in the story. So probably it's a tangent, but piece of advice for anybody in a workshop: those fellow writers and your instructor are not your readers, not your audience. So bear that in mind, right?
Yeah. Well, and I mean, kind of one of the cool things about all of us coming from very different life experiences and backgrounds is that, you know, you can expand people's worlds by putting in those little details. And that goes back to the kind of write what you know, like those little details that you know about certain things are interesting because they're unique to your experience, and not everybody has been, you know, in a location to hear spruce explode. And so that's immediately something that offers, you know, something of a unique flavor to whatever it is that you're writing. And I just wrote a short story that was also winter themed. And I've lived in Minnesota my whole life, and I'm like 8th generation Minnesotan. So like I'm very Minnesotan. And I had a blast putting in all of the winter things that like I've experienced, and like, you know, one that is kind of gross, but there was one that I laughed because I had one of my beta readers come back, and I talked about when you pull the scarf away from your face, and it's just like, you know, and it's so gross. And I put it in there because I was like, this is something that would happen in this situation if she's been out in this cold and trudging around, and like, and I had a reader that was like, oh my gosh, like I know you actually live in the North because of this specific detail. So I think, including, it's fun to take inspiration from extraneous sources. And I think that's really important to feed into that creative seed, like Andrew was talking about. But then when you add to it your own personal knowledge and experiences, I think that's where a lot of the authenticity really comes into play.
Yeah, but it doesn't matter sort of even how old you are or what your background is. Everything that you need to tell a good story, you already have.
Yeah.
In your life experience, you've already got it.
Yep.
So all this other stuff, this is the ongoing learning experience of details and specifics and bits of history and those kind of things. But what we're writing about at its core is the human condition, and we've all experienced that.
Yep.
So, it's all there. It's all there.
Yeah.
Yeah. I had to, example of that would be, I had to write, I had 2 death scenes I had to write. And one of them I based off an experience of a family member who had died. Had a hard enough time just writing it. Nevertheless, reading it and editing it. Nevertheless, recording the audiobook, I was a complete mess. And then the other character, I have this character dies in bed, old age, and I was able to write it. I could read it. It was great. It's fine. And then my grandma, I had another grandparent die, and me going back and reading that audiobook out loud, I cannot get through it because I had written it for my future self without the experience, realizing I had not lived that experience yet. And I didn't, I don't know how I did it, but it's in a good example of one was very much my life experience. The other one had not yet been lived, but it still hit the human condition.
Yeah. And I think that's where having that balance of here's things that I'm exploring and looking, kind of from an external view versus things I've experienced and what happens if I throw them all in a blender. So kind of, we talked about workshops a little bit, and I want to delve into what do you guys feel is or are common mistakes that you either see writers in general sometimes make with world building, or mistakes that you might have made in world building that you've changed how you approach something, or what have you noticed in your own writing or in writing in general with that?
You want to go ahead, Andrew?
Yeah, I can go. I think not being conscious of and intentionally reading or earning the reader's respect, or earning reader equity. Like a great example is the Council of Elrond. I'm not sure it was at the right spot necessarily in that particular book. If it would have been even in book 2, I mean, it's an important scene. It's an important scene, but it's a lot of info dumping. And was the had he earned the reader equity in order to do so? I think he probably had. But there are other times when other than authors will say, well, the Council of Elrond works, so I can do this big council at the beginning of my book. It's like, maybe. But have you thought through that you've earned the equity to earn the info dump, right? That you can, if you take the time to show where you do have expertise, say, I can't, but can you saddle a horse? Can you show that a horse can be saddled? Do you want to go into describing the saddle of the horse? Is it important? Great. Then other times you can have a moment when you just say something happened, and the reader then learns to trust that you probably know what you're talking about, so that when you do drop a quick line of world building, they trust you know what you're talking about. And that when you do then drop a big old info dump, is it something that they're like, okay, nope, he's got my attention. We're into the story. I'm ready to listen. And you've got that equity in your pocket. And even if you do it in the first page, if you know you're doing, I very often, I believe that if you know there's a possibility you might mess this up, you're probably more likely to get it right than if you didn't. And so just the act of saying, wait a minute, am I going to info dump here? Have I earned the reader's respect yet? Will let you better craft that particular page or 5 or 10 with more care than just dumping it out and not ever fixing it. So.
Can you ask the question again, Tori?
Yeah, for sure. So what's a common mistake that you see either in writing in general people make when it comes to world building, or a mistake that you might have made in your own writing career that you've kind of altered how you approach?
It's related. The only answer I can come up with is be very careful in selecting your point of view. And once you've selected it, constrain yourself to that point of view in terms of what is known, what is seen, what is witnessed. And my experience was I attempted a point of view of character Anamander Rake, only to realize that there is nothing in my life experience that can actually achieve any satisfying sense of authenticity to create that point of view. That I was going to need to only see this character from other characters' perspectives. And there was an unexpected benefit to that because it ended up elevating that character in the readers' minds. So it was a happy accident, but it wasn't anything I anticipated. I just you talk about imposter syndrome. I mean, I got to that character and attempted a number of times to do the point of view and realized I can't fake that. I cannot fake that point of view. And so I guess in terms of advice, be prepared to accept some humility in your capabilities. Sometimes you find yourself right out of your league, and that's okay. It's all right. As long as you recognize it and don't try to fake it, you can back up and you can come at it from a different angle, from a different point of view, and be not necessarily cautious, but be respectful of what it is you know versus what you don't know.
Knowing your limitations. Yeah.
Which is not to say don't be ambitious as hell, because I highly recommend be ambitious.
Yeah.
Push yourself to that limit where you're almost breaking the narrative and the novel, and stay there, because that's the learning. That's where you learn, right?
Yeah.
Everything else that you can do easily, you don't learn from that because you can do it easily, right? You got to get to those difficult places.
Yeah. And you know, when I talk to a lot of writers who are just starting out, who there are certain things that you can only learn by doing and trying and experimenting. And what if I wrote a point of view from Anamander? I go, oh, that's not working. You know, like you have to try and experiment in order to learn what your limitations are. Because when we first start, I'm like, I've read all these books. I can write an epic fantasy novel, you know, and I'm learning then this isn't the first book I've written, but it's the first epic fantasy. And I'm very quickly learning and trying to be aware of, okay, I'm hitting a point here where this might be a limitation. How am I gonna, you know, am I gonna go for it? Or do I feel like I need to take a different approach to this?
Yeah. And it's all right to fail. It's all right to fail. I mean, it's such a learning experience. Because one of the things I sort of picked up early on, and when I do workshops now, haven't done lately, but when I do, quite often a beginning writer sort of comes on board with this pervasive sense of certainty about how the world works, and it's their job as a writer to, you know, browbeat the reader into that particular point of view.
Yeah.
But to me, the writing process is a humbling process, and it should be a humbling process. As Andrew mentioned, in terms of writing scenes of a character's death and the grief that becomes part of that. The fact that you wrote for your future self must humble the hell out of you, right?
Yeah.
Those are the rewarding moments for the writer. It may be bitter in terms of that reward. You may resent it, but man, you need it. As a writer, you need those things.
Yeah. And I mean, as we get further and further into our craft and writing new things, that kind of ties in with, you know, I look back at things that I wrote 10 years ago
Mhm.
and go, you know, like, I mean, the predecessor to the book I'm writing now, I wrote 10 years ago, and I was like, I can write an epic fan, you know, and now looking back at it, I can see the nuggets of what I would become as a writer, which is the cool part about that, is when you look at it and accept those victories of, I had bits and pieces of who I am now, and that shows that authenticity of me finding my voice, which is really cool. But like, also it's humbling in the sense that, you know, the book I'm writing now, I know in 10 years I'm going to look back at it and say, you know, would I do all of like certain things differently? Probably.
Maybe not. Maybe not. I mean,
Maybe not.
Yeah, I look back on stuff that I wrote 20 years ago, thinking I was a better writer then than I am now, because I don't know how that got pulled off.
Yeah.
So, you know, the longer you go at it, my sense quite often is I'm past the peak, and so I'm sort of here. And what I'm working on now is the fumes of the gas tank. But there's still enough there in terms of craft that I can still put down what I need to put down.
Yeah.
But I don't think I have it in me to, for example, create the emotional investment of a 10 volume, 3 million word series. That ain't there anymore. Right. So line by line, page by page, yeah, I can still do that.
Yeah.
But the notion of a series of that extent, I could not pull that off.
I mean, I can't even, I'm looking at a trilogy and feeling incredibly overwhelmed. So, I mean, and I know I've heard other fantasy authors talking about, you know, once that big trilogy, or not trilogy, but the big series, that was the big, like, I mean, the amount of just accomplishment in finishing a series of that magnitude is amazing. But I can definitely see where it might then, like, but now what? You know, like what do I?
That's okay though too.
Yeah,
that's okay.
It is.
Look at Billy Joel, right? Billy Joel had only 6 albums, I think, and he got to the end and he's like, I'm good now. I've told all the stories I want to tell, and he's still got a career and it's still going. Now he, like you, Stephen, he invested so much blood into those 6 albums alone because he didn't write 6 hits. The studios didn't actually know what to put on the radio for his albums, because every single song on every album was written to the same level of detail, and he sweat that much blood on every single song that people go to the concerts not to listen to his 6 we all listen to on the radio. They go to listen to the rest of his body of work, because it's a big body of work. So we look at an artist who's still going 20 years strong, but they only have 5 hits. Billy Joel has 6 full albums of hits. He gets to keep performing, as opposed to being stuck playing the same 6 songs at every single concert. So it's not a bad thing to have laurels and then say, what do I get to do now, right? and now you get to experiment with whatever you want. That's a beautiful place to be as an artist. Yeah.
And I'm so excited about the book that you're working on about writing. I cannot wait. Having read your blogs, and I'm so excited for that. I'm going to be sitting there with my notebook.
With my 2 copies.
Right. Oh yeah. I'll have one to annotate and one to have on my shelf. Kind of closing us out with, when we think about outside of our own works, what are some of the storytelling authors and or book series that you find as examples of really excellent fantasy world building that you've been that you've noticed or been inspired by? Steve, I noticed earlier you mentioned Dune as potentially one of those, but are there any other series, books, authors that you think are really good examples of that?
Well, I mean, Robin Hobb comes to mind immediately. Phenomenal in terms of every aspect of storytelling is at peak in those books.
Yeah.
And I've even used sort of examples of her work in teaching point of view control, because it is impeccable, absolutely impeccable. So that is certainly one I would mention. But going beyond fantasy, I would say ones that really caught me were things like Ian Banks' culture novels. Basically, as far as I can tell, the only SF writer to ever completely sort of immerse themselves in post-scarcity galactic civilization, which is a whole different mindset than what we're familiar with. Our resource scrabbling type approach to things. That to this day impresses the hell out of me.
Yeah.
I'm gonna go with Lois McMaster Bujold. I discovered her just pre-COVID, finally, and when there were like no choices to listen to on my drive to work every day. So I had like an hour and a half of driving every day, and all of her books were on there. And I both Varkozigan Saga and Five Gods, and it's so interesting to see the growth of her as a writer from early 90s. I think Varkozigan started in 89 or something like that. And it's good. It's a good, solid writing. But then you get to World of Five Gods, and it's just mind-blowingly subtle. I put it right up there with Hobb in that she never info dumps, but there is so much there. There's so much subtext, and it's so beautiful and immersive that I do see in my mind. So I know not everybody does, as we're discovering, but I see everything in pictures, and there's nothing I've read that has more pictures in my head than something written by her. I know exactly what she's describing and what I'm seeing, and it's just the context is just so vast for very small stories. All of her stories are very local and very, very, two people in a scene ever, and yeah,
very, very, very cozy. Andrew?
Yeah, maybe. Yeah, comfy.
She's good.
Maybe more comfy than cozy, just because. Yeah, there is kind of a. I think I watched it before I read it, but like Appaloosa with Viggo Mortensen and Ed Harris, and the it's literally just the book told on film, and is very softly narrated, but there's a lot going on, and when it excites you, there's going to be a really big loud bang of a scene when you get to the action, and then it goes right back to a narrative that's soft and Mr. Rogers, but there's so much happening. It's not just let's go holding hands and running through the daisies. It's let's go holding hands and running through the life-threatening jellyfish that are hanging in the sky. And yeah, her books, and it's one of those things where like her books are all standalone. And so you can read one and be like, it could be months before you ever read another one of her books. And that's okay, because you're going to be thinking about it all that time and not feel like you need to glut yourself on every book, even though you kind of want to, but you also don't, because you do want to let each one of those books breathe like a fine wine, I guess. But yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I asked both of you to be on this episode because both of you have been very inspiring to me in terms of world building. And Steve, I know I talked about this a little bit on our last discussion, but I mean, 10 years ago when I read, or more than that now, when I read Gardens of the Moon and Dead House, it was so immersive for me back then. And coming out of those books felt like I was coming into a completely different reality. And just, I was so blown away by that, and really started to kind of try to figure out, okay, let's take notes. Why am I like, how is he doing this? And what is, what am I noticing? And I think, both of you create such a lived in world. And obviously Steve, with you, you have archives of history where you feel like, yeah, you're just a bystander in a world that has been here forever. And Andrew, there's so much detail in your world that builds on itself and creates this really, intricate kind of world and setting, and with all the characters, and there's so many pieces to it. So they're very different approaches, and yet both I find incredibly immersive. Robin Hobb was one that I was going to mention as well. I just started reading The Long Price Quartet by Daniel Abraham. And I found that to also already I think I'm almost 2 books in now. And same thing where I walked in and immediately, oh, this is a world that has like been here, and it feels very, immersive and detailed. And it doesn't feel like it's just a little offshoot of our world. It actually feels like its own contained place.
Well, that's sort of the thing. I mean, every trick, every craft trick that I did and have done, I've stolen from somewhere, from some other writer, right? So
yeah,
as a writer, you want to be reading and reading and reading, and when something is really done well, take note and really deconstruct how it worked and why it worked and all the rest, and then just stick it in the back of your head, and then as you're writing, when the right scene arrives, you've got that toolkit that you can reach into at that point.
Yeah.
And read outside your genre too, right? Like you talked about, someone comes into college and I'm going to write epic because I've read so much epic fantasy, and it's like, what are you going to write? Well, epic fantasy. In what way? Where's your spin? And like I had a whole, no longer reading fantasy era when I was like, oh, there's nothing good out. Didn't mean it was true, but I was closed-minded at the time. So I started reading outside of fantasy, and that's when I discovered Umberto Eco, Name of the Rose, and Pillars of the Earth. And from that, I was like, oh, priests done right. Oh my gosh. Yes. And so I wholesale stole that and said, how can I get Prior Philip into everything I write? And so there's just, and it's easy for us to say, I'm going to write all these epic fantasies. I read them all and I know how they do them wrong. Like, that's not how the FBI trains you to find a counterfeit bill, right? It's read good stuff. And if you read a lot of good stuff, and like you say, Stephen, find the things you love, and you will suddenly have Ocean's 11, right? Each one of those characters is from something else to create the perfect heist. And, what can you do to make your perfect epic fantasy? Not how you can fix epic fantasy, because you're gonna be the change. And it's like, okay, good luck. we're better. I as an encouraging way, we're better than that. We can be better than that. Be the change should not be fix the problems. It should be uplift the things that we see that we love, that we know we can be positive in.
Yeah, for sure. So I want to give you guys both a little bit of space. If there's anything that you have coming up that you want to promote to everybody in the chat, I do have both of your websites down in the description box for anybody that wants to go and find out more. But yeah, Andrew, what do you have coming up that you want people to know about?
I've got book 3 of the Clatian Saga coming out. August 30th is the tentative, probably pretty hard date for book 3. And then I'll have book 4 done this winter. Whether that means this year or next year, it'll be this winter, I promise. And then I have a novella coming out actually on the same day. I'm going to be doing a double/cover re-release of the whole series for a novella and book 3, and the novella will be free to the public.
Nice.
Well, I got all these irons in the fire, so I'm finishing the second book of the Witness trilogy. I got a Bocalan Corporal Brooch novella due, and Walk in Shadow, which is the third one of the Carcanis trilogy, and I've been talked into writing a standalone non-Malazan, either long short story or novella, which actually started on today.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, and that was a lot of fun. That required a lot of research, which made it a lot more fun. And and the interesting thing is, I took all these pages of notes, historical stuff, because it's set in our world. And when I started writing, I didn't look at that stuff at all, because the character voice just took off and took over on me. So when I need details, I'll go back to the notes, but it's not relevant to the narrative.
Right.
Yeah. So today was Breaking Ground Day.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Fun.
Yeah,
that's
that's
cool.
So exciting.
Yeah.
Do you find quickly, because I was thinking about this from I took a break to write a short story completely unrelated to my epic fantasy novel earlier this year. And I had a great time, and it was it jostled those creative juices. And it was just like, oh, wow. Like I needed that. And now I feel much more, boosted to go back into the book. Do you find that, switching up, going into something completely outside your norm does that for you as well?
Absolutely. Yep. Yeah. You need to cleanse the palate on occasion. And especially if you're writing fantasy, to slip into mimetic, real world stuff. Wow, it's just such a relief.
It can be, for sure.
You don't have to do the same amount of world building that you would in a secondary fantasy world.
Right.
That's all done for you, right? You set it in North Africa, and we know what North Africa looks like. I don't have to do any work there.
Yeah.
It could be just that act of putting your pen down, right? Like if you're feeling writer's block, or you're trying to work through a big shift in a plot you have to work on, you need to add this new character in, or whatever it is, working. Obviously, you could spend the same time just staring at a blank page and never working on it. But the act of doing something else, whether that's pulling out your paints and painting miniatures or painting, just doing that allows your then subconscious to fix a lot of those problems without you ever really thinking about it. And then all of a sudden you wake up in the middle of the night, you're like, I got it, I'm ready. And then you fall asleep and forget everything you thought about.
Yep. I keep a notepad right next to my bed, because at 2 a.m. it never fails. I'm like, Yep.
Well, everybody asks me why I write at 5 a.m. and why I fall asleep so fast. My wife can't stand that, because I used to stay up till 2 a.m. and now I can fall asleep in a heartbeat, because I don't get good sleep when I do this, but I'll go to sleep thinking of the scene I want to write in the morning. And then I'll wake up having processed it all night, and I'm ready to go. And it takes me about 5 minutes before all of a sudden there's words flying. I got no sleep because I was basically never hit REM, but I'm ready to go, just by allowing my subconscious to do the work so that I can. I mean, nothing's worse than a work dream that you don't get paid to do, right? Because you work all night and then don't get any words down. But when you actually do wake up and get the words down, the work dream's worth it.
Yeah. We had a question really quickly in the chat before we go. Erikson, have you read any China Mieville? That was brought up as one as a world building.
It was interesting. When Gardens of the Moon was first coming out, so I was so new to all of this, living in the UK, there was a bit of a book tour involved that brought me to Cambridge, I think. And I got there, and there were two other writers who were having their book launch at the same time. And that's where I first met China, because King Rat was coming out. So we hit it off pretty quickly and had a very interesting conversation. And China, I've since I don't run into that often since I don't live in the UK anymore. But the conference on the fantastic and the arts in Orlando, he's been guest of honor, and so have I. And I go there on a fairly regular basis. So when he's there, he's I was on the judges panel for the year he won for Perdido Street Station. So for the World Fantasy, I think it was. Might have been. Can't remember. Great writer.
Yeah.
There's a guy who understood ambition and went for it.
Yeah, Perdido Street Station has been making the rounds in my little community of readers, and I'm definitely excited to get to it, because it sounds pretty awesome. So, yeah, well, thank you guys both for spending time on the channel and for having the discussion. I really appreciate you both being here, so I appreciate that.
It was good fun.
Yeah. And thank you to everyone in the chat for hanging out with us and for your questions and comments through the episode. For anybody watching the replay, welcome. Thanks for joining us. And I will see you guys all in the next video. Bye, everybody.